Many people believe that faith means never feeling afraid. That a person of faith is someone who is always certain, calm, and completely confident at every moment. But when we look closely at the stories in the Bible, we discover something very different. True faith does not begin when everything is clear. Many times, faith appears precisely in the moments when life feels the most uncertain. Moments when the answers have not arrived yet. Moments when the path seems confusing. And it is exactly in those moments that many people begin to ask a very deep question. Where is God when things do not turn out the way we expected? In the previous episode, we saw something very important. We reflected on why Jesus never doubted his purpose. Jesus walked with an inner certainty that did not depend on circumstances. He knew who he was before God. But here an even deeper question appears. If we know who we are before God, what is it that sustains that certainty when the storms of life arrive? The answer to that question can be found in one of the most powerful teachings Jesus gave about faith. And when we understand that teaching, the way we look at difficulties can change completely. But to understand this, we first need to observe something very interesting in the way Jesus spoke about faith. When we look carefully at the way Jesus spoke about faith, we discover something that surprises many people. Jesus never presented faith as an ability reserved only for extraordinary people. He never said that only a few, after many years of spiritual experience, could truly learn to trust God. On the contrary, Jesus explained faith using a very simple image. He said that if someone had faith as small as a mustard seed, they could tell a mountain to move, and that mountain would move. And this statement is deeply interesting, because Jesus did not speak about enormous faith. He did not speak about perfect faith. He did not even speak about a faith without doubts. He spoke about a small faith. But here, something appears that many people overlook. If a faith that small can have such great power, why do so many people feel that their faith is not enough when difficult moments arrive? Maybe the problem is not the size of faith. Maybe the problem is how we understand what it truly means to trust God. And when we look more closely at the teachings of Jesus, we discover something that completely changes our perspective. Because for Jesus, faith was not only believing that something good would happen. Faith was a completely different way of walking through life. But to understand this clearly, we first need to observe something that happened with the people who walked with him every day. The people who walked with Jesus listened to these teachings very carefully. But at the same time, they were also living very human situations. They felt fear. They felt doubt. They felt uncertainty about what was happening and about what might happen next. And this is something very important to understand, because many people today imagine that the disciples were men who never doubted, never feared, and always knew exactly what to do. But when we read the stories that surround the life of Jesus, we discover something completely different. The disciples were learning. They were growing. They were trying to understand what it truly meant to trust God in the middle of real circumstances. Circumstances that often seemed outside their control. And it was precisely in those moments that Jesus revealed some of the deepest lessons about faith. Not when everything was calm, not when the path was completely clear, but when the circumstances seemed challenging. And here something very interesting appears. Because many times we think that faith reveals itself in great miracles. But in reality, faith often begins to reveal itself in something much simpler. In the small moments of decision, moments when a person chooses to keep trusting, even when they still cannot clearly see the end of the path. And that decision, even if it seems small, can completely transform the way a person walks through life. Perhaps, as you listen to this reflection, you may recognize something similar in your own life, because all of us, at some point, face situations where the path begins to feel uncertain. Moments when our plans do not move forward the way we expected. Moments when the answers take longer than we imagined. Moments when we begin to wonder if we are truly on the right path. And it is precisely in those moments that faith begins to become something much deeper. Not as a theory, not as a simple spiritual idea, but as an inner strength that sustains the heart when we still cannot clearly see what is happening. because the faith that Jesus taught was not a faith based only on immediate results. It was a faith based on trust. Trust that God is still working even when the process is not yet finished. And here is something that many people overlook. Faith does not mean that everything will be easy. Faith means that even when the path becomes difficult, we keep walking, we keep trusting, we keep moving forward step by step.
And that changed
And when
the
a
day.
person begins
Not
to
because
walk
the world
in this
became
way,
perfect,
something
but
very
because the
interesting
mind
starts
stopped
to happen
racing.
inside their
Because
heart.
when you accept
Fear
today,
begins to lose its
your soul
power.
expands.
But there is a
when you
very
let go of
important
tomorrow,
reason why this
your
happens.
chest is free.
And that reason
When you
appears
surrender
very
control,
clearly in
you
the
regain
teachings of
peace.
Jesus. When Jesus spoke about faith, he often used very simple examples. But behind those simple words, there was a deeply transformative truth. Jesus knew that faith is not built only in moments when everything is going well. In reality, faith begins to grow stronger, precisely when circumstances seem to move in the opposite direction. When our plans do not move forward the way we expected, when the answers do not appear immediately, when the path becomes more challenging than we imagined. And it is at that point that many people make a very common mistake. They think that if the path became difficult, then something must have gone wrong. They think that if obstacles appear, then perhaps God is not guiding that process. But when we observe the way Jesus taught about faith, we discover something completely different. Difficulties are not always a sign that we are on the wrong path. Many times, they are part of the process that strengthens our trust in God. Because true faith is not born only in moments of peace. Faith begins to reveal itself when someone chooses to keep trusting, even when they still cannot clearly see the final result. And when a person learns to walk in this way, something very powerful begins to change inside their heart. But there is a scene in the life of Jesus that reveals this truth even more clearly. On one occasion, the disciples of Jesus found themselves in a situation that would clearly reveal what it truly means to trust God. They were in a boat crossing the sea. At first, everything seemed calm. It was a journey like many others they had taken before. But suddenly something began to change. The wind started to rise. The waves began to strike the boat with greater force. And in a short time, the situation became much more dangerous than they had expected. The calm of the beginning had disappeared. Now everything seemed uncertain. The disciples began to feel afraid. And that fear was completely understandable. Because when a storm appears in the middle of the sea, even the most experienced sailors know that the situation can quickly become dangerous. But here, something appears that makes this story even more interesting. While all of this was happening, Jesus was there, in the same boat, in the middle of the same storm. And yet, the way Jesus responded to that situation was completely different. Because while fear began to take control of the hearts of the disciples, Jesus remained in a calm that seemed impossible to explain. And that calm revealed one of the deepest lessons about faith. As the storm grew stronger, the situation inside the boat became more and more concerning. The wind was blowing with great force. The waves were striking the boat again and again. Water began to enter, and with every passing minute, the sense of danger increased. The disciples looked around, trying to understand what was happening. Some tried to control the boat. Others looked at the sea with growing concern. Fear began to rise inside their hearts. Because when a storm appears in the middle of the sea, everything can change very quickly. And at that moment, for them, the situation seemed completely out of control. But in the middle of all that chaos, something deeply caught their attention. Jesus was there, in the same boat, in the middle of the same storm, and yet his attitude was completely different. While fear dominated the disciples, Jesus remained calm. He did not react with desperation. He did not seem controlled by fear. And that contrast revealed something very deep. Because the difference was not in the circumstances. They were all facing the same storm. The difference was in trust. And what was about to happen would reveal one of the most powerful lessons about faith. Finally, overwhelmed by fear and desperation, the disciples approached Jesus. The storm continued to strike the boat with force. The wind roared. The waves continued rising. And for them, the situation seemed more dangerous with every moment. So they woke Jesus and said something that clearly reveals what was happening inside their hearts. They said, "Lord, save us. We are perishing." Those words were not only a request for help, they were also an expression of fear, because in that moment, the disciples felt that the situation was completely out of control. But Jesus' response was surprising. Before doing anything, Jesus asked them a question that still reaches the human heart even today. He said, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And after saying those words, Jesus stood up. He looked at the wind, he looked at the sea, and he spoke. And in that very moment, something extraordinary happened. The wind began to calm, the waves began to settle. The storm that moments before seemed uncontrollable began to disappear, and the sea returned to calm. But the most important part of this story is not only the miracle, it is the profound lesson that Jesus was teaching in that moment. When the disciples saw what had just happened, they were completely astonished. The storm that moments before had seemed impossible to control had disappeared. The sea was calm, the wind had stopped, and in the middle of that silence, something began to change inside them. Because in that moment, they understood something very profound. The storm had been real. The fear had also been real. But Jesus had been there the entire time, in the same boat, in the middle of the same storm. And this story reveals a very important truth that many people forget. The storms of life are real. Moments of uncertainty exist. Moments of doubt are also part of the journey. But faith does not mean that we will never face storms. Faith means remembering that we are not alone inside the boat. God is still present even when the wind blows strongly, even when the waves begin to rise, even when the path seems uncertain. And when a person begins to remember this truth, something starts to change inside their heart. Fear begins to lose its strength. Trust begins to grow. If this message spoke to you today, write in the comments. God is with me. The story of the calming of the storm reminds us of a truth that we often forget when we face difficult moments. Faith does not mean that storms will never appear. Faith means remembering who is with us inside the boat. The disciples thought the situation was completely out of control. The wind was strong, the waves seemed dangerous. But Jesus had been there the entire time. And the same thing often happens in our lives. There are moments when the path seems uncertain, moments when the answers do not arrive as quickly as we expect. Moments when fear tries to take the place of trust. But even in those moments, God is still present, still guiding, still working, even when we cannot yet see the full outcome. Perhaps today you are also going through a storm. If this message spoke to your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember this truth. And if you want to go deeper into these reflections about faith and purpose, in the description you will find my ebook with teachings that can help strengthen your spiritual journey. Because many times, faith begins precisely in the moments when we decide to trust, even before the storm disappears. And in the next episode, we will see something even deeper. What this story teaches us about trusting God in the most challenging moments of life.